29 below zero. Every hearth in the valley is dying.
One window still burns. She hasn't lit a fire in days.
She hears it before she sees it. Something is coming. A sled breaks the drifts. Horses lathered. A family frozen. A fist meets the door she swore would never open again.
Sable Hollow sat low in the folds of Randolph County, West Virginia, a scatter of cabins pressed against ridgelines that blocked the sun until nearly 10 each winter morning. In the autumn of 1883, the valley knew Permelia Ashcroft as the blacksmith's daughter who had buried a husband 3 winters back and now raised a son and an ailing mother on a plot of stony ground along Sable Creek. She was 43, broad through the shoulders from years at her father's forge, her hands scarred in places where hot iron had taught her more than any schoolhouse ever could. She moved through the valley with the economy of a woman who had long since stopped explaining herself to people who weren't going to listen anyway. Her husband, Amos, had died of a fever the winter Eli turned 6, a death so quiet and so ordinary that Permelia had spent years afterward resenting how little the valley seemed to remember it by, as though a man could slip out of the world without so much as a dent left behind. She had sat with him 3 days while the fever climbed past anything the local remedies could touch, had watched him grow too weak to speak by the second night, and had learned in a stretch of helpless, watching a lesson she never spoke of afterward, that there were some failures a person could not outwork, could not outstubborn, no matter how hard her hands were willing to labor against them. It was a lesson that would sit underneath everything she built for the rest of her life, quiet and unspoken, the way a foundation sits under a house nobody thinks to thank it for holding up. Eli now stood 11 years old, and Adeline, Permelia's mother, had begun to whistle audibly through her chest on cold mornings, a sound the family had learned to dread more than any wolf at the tree line. The cabin they shared was tight, dovetailed chestnut logs between the limestone foundation her own father had laid 30 years earlier, and every autumn Permelia calculated firewood the way other women calculated flour, counting cords against the length of the coming season, praying the math would hold. She rose most mornings before the light did, tending the forge fire first, then Adeline's needs, then Eli's breakfast, an order of operations that left little room in the day for anything beyond the labor directly in front of her, and it was only in those quiet pre-dawn hours, alone with the bellows and the coals, that her mind was ever truly free to wander toward the kind of question a busier woman might never have found the space to ask at all. She had grown up beside that forge the way other children grew up beside a garden, learning early that iron rewarded patience the same way it punished haste, that a blade quenched too fast would crack along a seam invisible until the exact moment it mattered most. It was in the loft above the smithy, sorting through crates her father had left behind when his own heart gave out 2 winters past, that she found the drawing. Rolled tight in oilcloth, brittle at the edges, it showed a cross-section of hillside and cabin joined by a long sloping channel, notations in her father's cramped hand describing air drawn from a south-facing mouth, warmed by earth rising through a chimney vent. Beside the sketch, in ink gone the color of rust, he had written a single line that stopped her breath. The ground remembers summer longer than any man remembers winter. She sat with that drawing until the candle guttered, turning the page toward the light again and again as though a different angle might explain why a man who understood stone the way her father did had never once broken ground on it. She would learn later, from an old letter tucked behind a loose board near the forge's bellows, that fear of exactly this kind of ridicule had kept him from trying. A few lines in his own hand admitting that a man could carry for 30 years and still never trust himself enough to test it in daylight where his neighbors might watch him fail. He had written the plan down and then buried it the way some men bury regrets, deep enough that even they can pretend to forget where they left them. Permelia was not built for that particular kind of forgetting. She had inherited his hands, and it seemed some measure of his stubbornness, too, though hers had learned through bearing a husband young to move faster than his ever had. She did not tell Eli about the drawing at first, keeping it folded inside her apron pocket for the better part of 2 weeks while she turned the idea over during the slow hours at the forge, hammering horseshoes and amending lauba lathes with half her mind still tracing the sketched line of that buried channel. It was Adeline who noticed the distraction, catching her daughter staring past the anvil more than once with a hammer gone still in her hand. "You've got your father's look," Adeline said one evening, settling into her chair by the hearth with the particular effort her lungs now required for even that small motion. "He used to stare clean through a wall same as you're doing now," chewing on something he wasn't ready to say out loud. Permelia set the hammer down and for the first time spoke the idea aloud, watching her mother's face for the flicker of doubt she half expected. Adeline only nodded slowly, her breath rattling faint beneath her words. "Your father was afraid of a great many things he shouldn't have been. Don't you go inheriting that particular failing along with his eye for stone." The forge itself had been her father's before it was hers. A squat stone building set apart from the cabin so that sparks would never threaten the roof, and Permelia had spent enough of her girlhood at that anvil that the smell of hot iron still called up memories sharper than most of her actual childhood recollections. She remembered him teaching her to read color in a heated blade, how a dull orange meant patience and a white-hot glow meant ruin, how the difference between the two was often no more than a few careless seconds a person could never get back once they'd spent them. It was a lesson that had followed her into everything else she'd ever attempted, the marriage that had ended too soon, the mothering she did now mostly alone, and lately the digging of a trench that half the valley considered proof she'd finally lost whatever sense her father's training had once given her. She thought often, in those early weeks of planning, of the particular shame that must have sat in her father each time he passed the spot on the south slope where he'd never broken ground, the shame of a man who'd measured the angles correctly and still lacked the nerve to prove himself right in front of neighbors who would have laughed exactly as hard at him as they now laughed at her. She had loved him without reservation her whole life, and it unsettled her to discover so many years after his death this one soft place in him she'd never known to look for, a fear so quiet it had left no mark on the man she remembered, only on the paper he'd left behind. Silas Broderick had farmed the parcel adjoining hers for going on 20 years, long enough to have watched Permelia grow from a girl trailing her father to the mill into the widow, now raising a boy of her own, and there was, underneath his mockery, a genuine if poorly expressed affection for the family, the particular gruff concern of a man who had buried a wife of his own and understood better than most exactly what a widow stood to lose if her gambles went wrong. He would never have named that affection aloud, would likely have denied it existed at all if pressed, but it colored his early scorn all the same, giving it an edge closer to worry than cruelty even when the words themselves landed hard. By the following May she had walked the south slope 30 paces from her cabin door a dozen times, watching how the sun struck it from 9 past 3, the same exposure her father had favored for the root cellar that still held potatoes firm and cool through August. She drove stakes into the ground and strung a level line between them, sighting down its length the way she'd once watched her father true a foundation course, and it was there that Silas Broderick found her, his wagon creaking to a stop on the rutted lane, his face arranging itself into the particular expression men reserve for women doing something they've decided not to understand. He didn't dismount. He simply looked at the stakes, then at her, then back at the stakes, and the corner of his mouth pulled sideways. "Digging your husband's grave a second time, Permelia, or just practicing for your own?" The words landed exactly where he intended them to land, and she felt the old grief flare briefly under her ribs before she pushed it down where it belonged, out of sight, out of use. She had learned in the 3 years since Amos died that grief handled badly in front of witnesses only gave those witnesses more to talk about, and she was not about to hand Silas Broderick a single extra word to carry back to the mill. She explained it anyway, because explaining things had always been her way of proving to herself that the explanation held. The ground several feet down stayed near 60 degrees even at the coldest edge of January, she told him, and if she could warm air at the hillside mouth and run it through a long buried channel packed round with stone, the earth would hold that warmth the way a good hearth holds a coal bed overnight, releasing it slow instead of burning it fast. Broderick let her finish before he laughed, not unkindly, the laugh of a man who has decided the conversation is already over. "Heat climbs, same as smoke climbs, same as prayer climbs. You send warm air downhill first, it forgets how to be warm before it ever finds your door." He clicked his tongue at his team and rolled on without waiting to hear whether she had an answer for that, the wheels rattling off down the lane while Permelia stood with the level lines netting in her hand, watching him go, filing the exchange away the way she filed every piece of scrap iron that someday prove useful even if it looked worthless in the moment. Word of the stakes reached Ambrose Kettle before the week was out, and he arrived hauling split oak past the property with his mule straining under the load, pausing just long enough to deliver his own verdict without being asked for it. Physics didn't care what a woman believed about the ground, he told her, resting one boot on his wagon wheel, his voice pitched for an audience that wasn't there yet, but soon would be. Cold sank and heat rose, and no amount of trench work in Randolph County was going to argue that law of God and nature into submission. He spent 30 winters feeding a hearth and knew exactly what worked, he said, and what worked was iron and oak, not holes in a hillside. He said it with the particular satisfaction of a man who had never once had to question whether his own methods might fail him, and Permelia noted, without saying so, that a man that certain had likely never once had to bury someone the old methods couldn't save either. She watched his wagon rattle off down the same rutted lane Broderick's had taken not an hour before, and found herself, not for the first time that week, wondering whether the valley's loudest doubts always arrived dressed in exactly that kind of borrowed certainty, men repeating what their fathers had told them without ever once testing whether the telling still held true. Verity Longstreet came by that same week under the pretense of borrowing a hay rake, though Permelia understood well enough that curiosity had done most of the walking. Verity ran her own homestead since her husband's accident left him with one working arm, a mill injury 3 years back that had taken most of the strength from his right side and left the family's whole operation resting more heavily on Verity's shoulders than either of them liked to admit out loud. She had earned every ounce of her skepticism the hard way, through seasons where a single miscalculation meant hunger by February, and Permelia had watched her, across those same seasons, grow into exactly the kind of practical, unsentimental competence that a widow raising a boy alone couldn't help but respect even while disagreeing with it. When Permelia described the hillside collector she meant to build, a hinged mica pane scavenged and set into a blackened box to trap morning sun, Verity's mouth twitched with the effort of not laughing outright. "You're building a window for the moles, then," she said, though her tone carried less venom than the men's, the doubt underneath it cut just as deep, because Verity's doubt came from experience rather than pride, and experience was harder to argue with than pride ever was. She lingered a while longer than a borrowed rake required, watching Permelia's stakes with an expression that mixed genuine worry with something almost like envy, the look of a woman who had spent a decade doing everything exactly right by the old rules and had precious little slack left over for anyone else's experiments to fail beside her own. Before she left, she added, almost gently for her, that a woman with a husband still living to wood had at least some room to gamble that a woman entirely alone did not, and Permelia understood the comment for the strange backhanded kindness it was, an acknowledgement that Verity's caution came less from cruelty than from a fear she'd simply learned to wear as practicality. Ambrose Kettle's own household, though he rarely spoke of it in the boastful terms he reserved for his opinions on physics, was not so different from Permelia's in its particulars. A wife and 4 children crowded into a cabin no larger than her own, a woodpile that had to stretch further each year as the children grew and needed more warmth than infants ever had. He fed his hearth with the specific anxiety of a man who had once, as a boy, watched his own younger brothers succumb to a fever brought on by winter too cold and too damp for the family's means, and though he never once connected that old grief to his fierce defense of conventional heating, Permelia would come to understand much later that his loudest certainties often grew from the deepest of his fears rather than any confidence at all. Cornelius Thane heard about the project from 3 separate customers before he ever rode out to see it himself, and each retelling had sharpened his interest into something closer to alarm than curiosity. Thane owned the only stove and hearth goods shop within a day's ride of Sable Hollow, a narrow storefront in the county seat stocked with cast-iron parlor stoves, stovepipe damper plates, and the promise of warmth that every family in the valley eventually came to purchase. He had built that shop from nothing over 6 years, had married Margaret the same spring he'd opened its doors, had watched 2 sons grow up sleeping above the storeroom before the family finally afforded a proper house behind it. What none of his customers knew, and what he guarded the way other men guarded a wound, was the letter from the Wheeling Bank sitting in his desk drawer, 3 months overdue, threatening to call the note on his inventory if the coming season's sales didn't cover what he already owed. He had over-ordered the previous spring, certain the valley would keep buying the way it always had, and now every family that didn't need a new stove was a family that might sink him. He had rehearsed the visit on the ride out, telling himself he only meant to satisfy his own curiosity, to see with his own eyes whether the rumors of the widow's foolishness were as complete as his customers made them sound. But some quieter part of him already understood, even before he'd reached her gate, that curiosity was not the whole of what had brought him. He found Permelia at the trench mouth, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he didn't dismount either, choosing instead to look down at her from the wagon seat in a way that made the height feel deliberate. A widow with a boy to raise ought to think twice before she gambles the only shelter she's got on a notion nobody's ever proved, he said, and the concern in his voice was pitched carefully enough that a stranger might have mistaken it for kindness. She told him she wasn't gambling anything, that she'd calculated the grade and the exposure the same way her father had calculated foundation loads for 30 years without a single wall coming down. Thane's smile thinned. "Calculations don't keep a family warm, ma'am. Iron does. And when the ground swallows your firewood money along with your labor, my shop'll still be standing, same as it always has." He rode off without waiting for a reply, and Permelia stood watching the dust settle behind his wagon, understanding without yet being able to name it that his opposition carried a weight the others didn't, something colder and more deliberate underneath the concern. She began cutting the trench in the first week of June, working mornings before the forge needed tending and evenings until the light gave out, Eli beside her more often than not hauling loosened clay in a wooden barrow his grandfather had built decades before. He was a serious boy, quiet in the way of children who have already learned that the adults around them can disappear without warning. And he took to the work with attention that surprised her, asking questions about the grade and the stone that she hadn't expected an 11-year-old to think to ask. Grandpa Ashcroft drew this and never dug it, he said one evening, turning the oilcloth drawing over in his hands with a care that made her chest tighten. Why didn't he? She didn't have an answer that satisfied either of them, only the suspicion that some kinds of fear outlast the men who carry them, passed down quiet as a birthmark until someone finally decides to stop inheriting them. There were evenings in that first stretch of digging when Eli would set his shovel aside and simply watch his mother work, and she caught him once studying her hands the way she herself had once studied her father's, tracing with his eyes the particular economy of motion that came from years at a forge, the way she never wasted a stroke, never fought the tool, only guided it. He asked her, one such evening, whether she'd ever been afraid the whole valley might be right and she might be wrong, and she considered the question longer than she let on, resting on the handle of her shovel while the last light drained out of the sky above the ridgeline. Being afraid and being wrong ain't the same thing, she told him finally. Your grandfather was afraid and never found out whether he was wrong. I'd rather dig myself into an answer than sit on a question my whole life. By midsummer, the trench ran nearly level for 40 feet. 24 inches wide and 24 high, cut straight through clay and loam without lining or reinforcement, and Permelia's trained eye caught the trouble before the first real test arrived. The floor held slight depressions where her shovel had wandered off true. The raw walls wept moisture where the clay gave way to looser soil. The perfectly level run offered no fall for drainage, no gradient to help air find its own way, and she stood at the hillside mouth one evening running her palm along the rough stone, feeling the flatness of it, and something in her gut told her the flatness itself might be the failure waiting to happen. She said nothing of the worry to Eli that night, not wanting to hand a boy her doubt before she'd had the chance to test whether the doubt was even warranted. The storm arrived in late July with 3 days of driving rain that turned the yard to soup and sent Sable Creek climbing its banks by nearly a foot. Water found every weakness the raw trench had been hiding, seeping through the loose walls, pooling in the low spots her shovel had left unlevel, and by the fourth morning after the rain broke, Permelia waded into her own with a lantern held high and found standing water deep enough to swallow her boots to the ankle. She measured it with a willow switch the way her father had once taught her to sound a well, marking depth at intervals along the full 40 feet, and the pattern that emerged told her everything she needed and nothing she wanted to hear. Without consistent fall toward daylight, the water had nowhere to travel. Without dense, smooth walls, air would drag against rough clay instead of moving freely along its length. The very design she had trusted was in its current form, working against the natural draft it was meant to create. She sat at the trench mouth that evening with mud drying stiff on her skirts, the willow switch still in her hand, and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of something close to despair before she made herself stand back up, because despair was a luxury a widow with a boy and a sick mother couldn't afford to keep past sundown. It was in that stretch of quiet, staring down 40 feet of failure, that the line came to her the way certain truths arrive only after they've cost something. A hole in the ground don't care how hard you work to dig it, only whether you dug it right. And she said it aloud to no one, low under her breath, the way a person says a thing they intend to remember. The rain had stopped by the time she made her way back up the muddy path toward the cabin, though the clouds still hung low and heavy over the ridgeline, and she found herself halfway up that familiar slope, stopping to look back down at the flooded trench mouth one last time before darkness swallowed it entirely, trying to decide whether what she felt looking at it was grief or simply the ordinary ache of hard work undone. She walked back to the cabin that night soaked through and found Eli waiting up for her despite the hour, a mug of chicory coffee gone cold on the table beside him, his face drawn with a worry no boy his age should have to carry over a hole in the ground. He asked her, once she'd peeled off her ruined boots, whether they were going to quit, and she looked at him a long moment before she answered, weighing how much truth an 11-year-old could hold without it curdling into fear. We're not quitting, she said finally. We're starting over smarter. There's a difference. And I intend for you to learn it now instead of waiting till you're grown to find out the hard way. He nodded, and though his eyes were tired, something in his posture eased, the particular relief of a child discovering that a parent's resolve had not in fact drowned along with the trench. Word of the flooding reached the valley faster than Permelia would have liked, carried mostly by Broderick, who took evident satisfaction in describing the ruined trench to anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen. Kettle repeated the story at the mill with embellishments that grew the standing water from ankle-deep to waist-deep by the third retelling. Even Verity, who had never mocked as openly as the men, allowed that perhaps some ideas were better left buried than dug, a comment that reached Permelia secondhand and stung worse for the gentleness in which it had been delivered. Thane heard the news at his shop counter from a customer buying stovepipe fittings, and though he kept his face arranged in polite sympathy, something in his chest loosened for the first time in weeks. He mentioned almost offhand that a woman ought not to be ashamed of admitting when an idea had failed, that plenty of good families had learned the hard way that tradition existed for a reason, and if Permelia found herself needing stove parts before the season turned, his shop would extend her the same credit he extended anyone. The offer sounded generous. It was in truth a hook set carefully into water he intended to keep troubled. He rehearsed the line twice before he ever said it aloud to a customer, the way a man rehearses something he needs to believe about himself before he can say it convincingly to anyone else. Reverend Elihu Prescott called at the cabin not long after, less to mock than to voice a concern that had been building in him since he first heard of the project, and his worry carried a different weight than the neighbor's scorn because it touched directly on the boy asleep in the loft above them. He was a careful man by nature, the kind who chose his words the way other men chose which board to nail down first, and he had buried enough children in his years shepherding the valley's small congregation to carry every one of those small graves somewhere close beneath his ordinary composure. He spoke of stagnant vapors that might gather in a buried passage, of unhealthy air drawn up into living quarters where a child breathed it through the night, and though his tone stayed gentle, the warning found its target with the particular authority of a man whose job it was, in some sense, to worry on behalf of the whole valley's children at once. Permelia had buried one husband already. The thought of endangering Eli through her own stubbornness sat in her stomach like a stone swallowed whole, and for 2 full days after the Reverend's visit she found herself standing at the ruined trench mouth, unable to decide whether continuing was courage or recklessness wearing courage's coat. It was Adeline, wheezing through the worst of that week's damp air, who settled the question without meaning to. Permelia found her mother sitting up past midnight, a shawl wrapped tight, the whistle in her chest audible from across the room even over the crackle of the banked fire, and watching her struggle for breath in a cabin already smoke-heavy from the hearth crossed something in Permelia that no amount of neighborly ridicule had managed to touch. Clean air, dry air that didn't require choking down smoke to survive a January night, stopped being an engineering preference in that moment and became something closer to a debt she owed the woman who'd raised her. She knelt beside her mother's chair and said, more to herself than to Adeline, I buried your husband's fear along with him. I won't bury yours too. And Adeline, too breathless to answer in full sentences, only reached out and gripped her daughter's wrist, hard the way a person grips something they intend to keep. The recutting began within days, and this time Permelia worked with a precision that frontier labor rarely demanded of anyone, let alone a widow doing the digging herself with only an 11-year-old's help, and on the better afternoons the borrowed hands of Ezekiel Marsh, the old stonemason who had known her father and who watched her work for the better part of an hour before he ever said a word. Marsh had built half the foundations in Sable Hollow over 4 decades of quiet, unglamorous labor, cellars, spring houses, and the occasional church wall, and he had long since stopped caring what a valley's gossip made of any particular project, so long as the stone itself was cut and set correctly. He had known Permelia's father well enough to have shared a supper table with him more than once, and though he'd never once heard the older man speak of any buried tunnel scheme, something in my daughter's careful, methodical grading reminded him strongly enough of the father that he found himself returning to help long after a simple neighborly gesture would have run its course. Marsh had a reputation in the valley for saying little and meaning every syllable of what he did say, and when he finally spoke that first afternoon it was not to offer an opinion on the project itself, but simply to ask whether she'd accounted for frost heave along the crown, a question so specific and so clearly rooted in genuine engineering concern rather than mockery that Permelia felt something in her shoulders unclench for the first time in weeks. She recut the tunnel bottom with a uniform 3/4-inch fall per foot for the first 22 feet, establishing a true downhill grade from the hillside mouth toward what would become a drainage sump lined with river gravel, a narrow French drain daylighting well below the entrance to carry off anything the earth couldn't hold. The final 18 feet climbed the opposite direction, rising half an inch per foot back toward the cabin foundation, a grade she measured and remeasured with a spirit level until her arms ached, because she understood now that too steep a rise would churn the air into useless turbulence, and too gentle a rise would leave it too sluggish to draw at all. Eli learned to read the levels bubble as well as she could by the second week, calling out corrections in a voice that had begun, without either of them quite noticing, to carry the same flat confidence his mother's did. Marsh ran his weathered hands along the newly cut walls one afternoon in early September, crouching low to sight down the grade the way a man checks a rifle barrel for true, and when he straightened up he delivered his verdict without embellishment, in the flat tone of a craftsman who had no reason left in life to flatter anyone. "Stone it right, pack the crown tight, and this'll hold weather like a cave holds winter," he said. And though the words carried no promise about heat or air or anything beyond the tunnel's bare structural soundness, Permelia felt something in her chest unclench for the first time since the flood, because Marsh's approval, unlike anyone else's in the valley, was not a thing he gave lightly. He stayed on longer than he'd planned that afternoon, showing her how to key the crown stone so the whole arch would lock itself tighter under load rather than looser. A trick he said he'd learned from his own father digging root cellars 2 counties over, back before the war, back when a man's whole winter survival sometimes hung on exactly this kind of buried, unglamorous craft. She relined the full 40 feet through the remainder of September, selecting fieldstone by hand and fitting it into walls 4 inches thick, each piece placed to shed moisture inward and down toward the gravel bed rather than pooling against the clay behind it. Eli worked the crown stones with her in the evenings, his small hands surprisingly steady at setting the interlocking pieces that would keep the ceiling from settling under frost. And there were nights she caught him talking to the tunnel walls under his breath, the way boys talk to things they've decided to trust, murmuring instructions about staying dry, staying strong, holding through the winter, the way his grandfather's foundation stones had held for 30 years without complaint. She never teased him for it. She had caught herself doing much the same thing, alone at the forge, addressing a half-shaped damper as though it could hear her instructions and take them to heart. The lime sand wash came next, mixed from local lime and river sand fine enough to spread thin without smothering the stone's thermal mass, and it was Dr. Josephine Rowan who arrived unannounced one gray October morning to help apply it, bucket and brush in hand before Permelia had even finished explaining what the work required. Rowan had trained in Baltimore before returning to Randolph County to practice, one of the few women in the region to hold a proper medical license, and she had spent her early years back home fighting for the trust that came automatically to any man who hung a similar shingle, a fight that had left her with little patience left over for doubting a fellow woman's competence simply because a valley of skeptical men found it easier to laugh than to look closely. Her medical practice carried her into cabins across the county where children coughed through smoke-choked winters, and she had watched enough of that suffering to recognize in Permelia's design the first real promise of something better than a hearth burning at the edge of what a small chest could tolerate. She worked alongside Permelia in near silence for most of the morning, and when she finally spoke, it was with the plain conviction of a woman accustomed to being doubted in her own profession and unwilling to extend that same doubt to another. "Half the graves I dig markers for in this valley belong to children who never got a full breath in their own homes," she said, drawing the wash smooth along a stone course. "If you've found a way around that, I don't much care whether it looks strange to men who've never had to sit up all night listening to a child struggle for air." Rowan lingered after the wash dried, watching Adeline move about the cabin with an ease that had grown more pronounced through the autumn, and she pressed 2 fingers briefly to the older woman's wrist without being asked, the reflexive habit of a physician who never quite stopped working even on a social visit. "Your color's better than it was in the spring," she told Adeline, and though she offered no medical ache explanation for why that might be, the implication sat plain enough in the room that even Permelia, still elbow-deep in lime wash, allowed herself a small private satisfaction she was careful not to let show on her face. The hillside collector took shape over 2 days of carpentry rather than masonry. A simple blackened box fitted with the same hinged mica pane Verity had once mocked as a window for moles, a removable screen set beneath it to keep insects and debris from drifting into the channel proper. At the cabin end, Permelia cut a stone vent 10 by 12 inches through the foundation wall and fitted it with a hand-forged damper she'd shaped herself at the forge, an adjustable louver that let her choke the airflow down to nothing or open it wide, depending on what the day demanded. Above, near the roof ridge, she bored a 4-inch vent to complete the circuit, the opening through which warmed air would finally escape, and in escaping, pull fresh air behind it through 4 feet of stone and earth. The test came on a bright afternoon in the second week of October, the kind of clear autumn day that seemed to arrive specifically to settle an argument that had consumed the better part of a season. Permelia struck a sulfur match at the collector mouth and watched the acrid smoke thread inward without hesitation, vanishing into the dark of the tunnel, and she stood at the ouchnation vent, counting seconds under her breath until the same smoke emerged, faint but unmistakable, curling up out of the ridge vent above the roofline. Her indoor thermometer, positioned well clear of the hearth, read 46 degrees at mid-afternoon. By dusk it read 60, no wood, no coal had glowed. The cabin had warmed 14 degrees on nothing but autumn sun and the patient, borrowed heat of the earth itself, and Permelia stood in her own doorway with her hand pressed flat against the warm stone of the vent, feeling something under her ribs that she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the flood, something that wasn't quite triumph yet but had triumph's shape waiting inside it. Eli came running from the yard when he felt the change in the air, pressing his palm against the same warm stone his mother's hand still rested on, and he looked up at her with an expression she would carry for the rest of her life, equal parts disbelief and pride, the look of a boy discovering that his mother's stubbornness had this once been something closer to genius. "Grandpa should have dug it," he said quietly, and Permelia only nodded, because there was nothing left to add to that particular grief, only the work still ahead of proving it to a valley that hadn't yet seen what she'd just seen with her own eyes. Adeline came to the doorway behind them, drawn by the sound of Eli's shouting, and stood a long moment with her palm pressed to the same warm stone, saying nothing at all, though the ease that spread across her face said more than any words she might have chosen. They sat together that evening longer than usual before the small cook-stove, none of them in any hurry to move, the unfamiliar comfort of warmth that had cost nothing settling over the cabin like a held breath finally released. Adeline's chest, for the first time in longer than Permelia could easily remember, made no sounds at all through supper, and it was Eli who finally broke the quiet, asking whether they might now finally tell Broderick and Kettle what they'd built. A question that carried in it all the impatience of an 11-year-old eager for vindication rather than the more measured pace his mother intended to take. "Let them come find out on their own," Permelia told him, banking the small fire for the night. "A thing proven quiet holds up better than a thing shouted from a rooftop. We'll let the winter do our shouting for us." News of the successful test spread through Sable Hollow within days, carried this time not by Broderick's mockery but by Marsh's own quiet confirmation to anyone who asked, and the community's response split along lines that would only deepen as winter approached. Verity Longstreet came by within the week, not to apologize outright but to offer, in her own practical fashion, to sew a felt curtain for the interior damper, a hedge against failure that revealed more genuine hope than her words let on. "If the thing quits on you come January, at least you won't be heating the whole hollow through an open hole in your wall," she said, and Permelia understood the offer for what it was, cautious faith dressed up as caution alone. Reverend Prescott's opposition, by contrast, sharpened rather than softened. He raised his concerns before a small gathering after Sunday service, warning that whatever warmth the tunnel produced might come at the cost of air no decent family should breathe, air that had passed through raw earth and buried stone rather than through God's own open sky. And though his tone remained measured, the fear he stirred in a few of the younger mothers present was real enough that Permelia felt its weight the next time she walked past their cabins and caught them watching her with something closer to worry than scorn. Thane, for his part, adjusted his strategy the moment word reached him that the test had succeeded. He could no longer count on the tunnel failing outright, and so he shifted instead to sowing doubt about its endurance, remarking to customers that any fool contraption might work on a mild October afternoon, but that true Appalachian winter, the kind that split stone and froze creeks solid, was an entirely different trial, one no widow's hillside experiment had ever been asked to survive. He said it with the easy confidence of a man selling insurance against a disaster he privately hoped would come, and beneath that confidence, in the ledger drawer of his shop, the letter from the Wheeling Bank sat unanswered, its deadline creeping closer with every week that passed without the season's expected stove sales. He had begun, without quite admitting it to himself yet, watching the road toward Permelia's cabin whenever his business carried him past it, noting the trench mouth, the drainage sump, the exact places a determined man might do the most damage with the least evidence left behind. Permelia spent the last weeks of October and into November completing the system in 4 distinct phases, working now with Marsh's occasional guidance and Eli's steady labor beside her, the pace unhurried but relentless, the pace of a woman who had learned the hard way what happened when precision gave way to haste. The grading and dimension work took the better part of 9 days, confirming the drainage held true along every foot of the run through 2 hard rains that came and went without leaving so much as a puddle behind. The stone lining and pointing consumed 6 more, Permelia's hands blistering fresh despite calluses built over years at the forge, because masonry demanded a different kind of grip than iron ever had, and she found herself, more than once, grateful for Marsh's patient corrections when her courses ran uneven. The collector box and its mica pane took only 2 days, carpentry work that felt almost restful after the stone, and the final 3 days went to the foundation vent and damper, the last connection between 40 feet of buried stone and the small warm world of the cabin above it. She marked the completion in her ledger with a single line, dated and precise, the way her father had once closed out his own accounts, and she noticed, reading it back, that she had not once written the word finally, though the word had certainly been sitting somewhere behind every sentence she'd set down that autumn. Her hands, by the time the last stone was set, bore the particular map of scars that honest labor left behind, new blisters layered over old calisses layered over the burn marks the forge had given her years before, and she found some private satisfaction in tracing that map each evening, a record of the work every bit as honest as the ledger itself. Eli, watching her hands at the supper table one of those final evenings, asked whether the work had been worth the cost of them, and Permelia considered the question with the same seriousness she gave everything he asked her. "Hands heal," she told him. "Regret don't, not the same way." I'd rather carry scars from work I finished than carry the particular ache of a thing I left buried out of fear. Your grandfather carried that second kind his whole life, and I watched it cost him more than any blister ever could. Through those same weeks, the rest of the valley pressed forward with the methods it had always trusted, each family's preparations a quiet rebuke to Permelia's continued labor. Kettle doubled the length of his stovepipe and fitted a tin heat shed to wring more warmth from his rising smoke before it escaped. Broderick rebuilt his hearth wider still, laying in a full extra cord of split oak against whatever the season might demand of him. Verity kept her cook's stovebank through the coldest hours and hung a second layer of quilts across her doorframe, the same layered defense her mother and grandmother had relied on before her. It was in its own way a valley holding its breath, half of it certain the widow's foolishness would soon be forgotten, half of it unwilling to admit how badly it hoped otherwise. By the first week of December, Permelia's own preliminary trials had begun to answer that unspoken hope with numbers she recorded each evening, in a ledger she kept as carefully as her father had once kept his stone account. On clear days, the cabin held between 60 and 65 degrees without a single log burning, the foundation stone warm to the touch at dawn the way a hearthstone stays warm long after the fire beneath it has died. On the overcast days that December brought more often than not, she needed only a small bed of coal to carry the cooking, the tunnel absorbing the burden that would otherwise have demanded a full day's wood. Her consumption, measured against what she knew her neighbors were burning, ran at a fraction even she hadn't quite dared to predict, and each night she sat by lamplight, adding the day's figures to the column, watching a Kate's build itself in ink that no amount of Broderick's laughter or Thane's whispered doubt could argue away. It was on one of those December evenings, the ledger open on the table and Eli asleep in the loft, that Ottiline, breathing easier than Permelia had heard her breathe in months, reached across and laid her hand flat over her daughter's, over the ink-stained fingers that had spent the better part of a year proving a dead man's buried idea right. "Your father drew it and was afraid to dig it," she said, her voice thin but steady. "You dug it afraid, and that's the whole difference between the two of you." Permelia said nothing for a long moment, only turned her hand beneath her mother's until their palms met, and outside the wind moved down off the ridge the way it always did in early December, carrying the first promise of a winter with it not yet shown the valley its true face, with a violence none of them, though the numbers of them could yet imagine, numbers remarkable, patient. As they looked on the page, were already writing the first. The first true test of Permelia's winter came not from the sky but from her neighbors, in the slow thaw of doubt that followed her December numbers through the valley like water finding the lowest ground. By January, the ledger held 6 full weeks of readings, temperatures that held steady in the high 50s on the grimmest overcast days, climbed past 60 whenever the sun found the collector's mica pane for even an hour. She had begun sharing those numbers with anyone who asked, not to boast but because a woman who had spent a year defending an idea with nothing but conviction had learned the value of proof that didn't depend on anyone believing her word alone. Broderick's mockery thinned first, not into admiration but into a wary silence that Permelia found almost more unsettling than his laughter had been. He still drove his wagon past her cabin most mornings, still glanced toward the hillside collector with an expression she couldn't quite name, but the books had stopped, replaced by something closer to calculation. A man doing sums in his head he wasn't yet ready to say aloud. Kettle held his ground longer, insisting to anyone who'd listened that a mild winter proved nothing, that the valley hadn't seen a true test since before his father's time, though even he had begun asking marsh-pointed questions about grade and gravel whenever the old mason came through the mill for supplies. It was Dr. Rowan who first suggested, over a cup of chicory coffee at Permelia's own table, that the tunnel's real proof would come from somewhere the valley hadn't yet thought to look. "You've shown them it works, and that's not a good deed," she said, turning her cup slowly between her hands. "What you haven't shown them is what happens on the worst one God can send. Until that day comes, Cornelius Thane and men like him will keep their doubts alive on nothing more than hope that it never does." Permelia turned the words over long after Rowan had gone, understanding even then that her vindication, whenever it finally arrived, would not come cheap, would likely come dressed in exactly the kind of suffering she wouldn't wish on anyone in the Hollow, herself included. Thane heard the same numbers everyone else had heard, filtered through customers who mentioned the widow's tunnel with a curiosity that unsettled him more than outright praise would have. His shop had moved less stove iron that winter than any season in the 6 years he'd owned it, families choosing to make do with what they already had rather than invest in new hearthware, while a free alternative sat proving itself a half-mile up the creek. The letter from Wheeling had grown a second page by January, the bank's language sharpening from concern into something closer to warning, and Thane began doing the kind of arithmetic in his ledger book that left his hands unsteady by lamplight, subtracting what he owed from what he had, watching the difference shrink toward a number he didn't want to name even to himself. Margaret found him at that ledger more nights than she said anything about, and on one of those nights when he finally set the pen down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, she asked him plainly whether they were going to lose the shop. He didn't answer her, which she understood in the particular language of a marriage worn smooth by years as an answer all its own. Margaret Thane had grown up the daughter of a wheeling merchant herself, and she understood banking language well enough to read the shift in her husband's letters, even when he tried to keep the worst of them folded away in his desk drawer. And there were nights that January when she lay awake beside him, counting in her own head exactly how many stoves would need to sell before spring to keep the note current, arriving each time at a number that felt further out of reach than it had the month before. She never once suggested he abandon the fight, only asked him on one particularly sleepless night whether pride was going to be the thing that finally cost them the house, a question he answered with silence rather than denial, which told her everything she needed to know about how close to the edge his composure had actually come. He rode out to Permelia's place twice more that winter under the pretense of neighborly concern, each visit calibrated to plant a seed rather than harvest one. The first time he mentioned, almost in passing, that buried structures had a way of shifting once true frost set into the ground, that stone laid in autumn sometimes heaved come the deepest cold, cracking along seams no eye'd catch before the damage was done. The second time he brought up children directly, noting that Reverend Prescott's concerns about buried air weren't nothing, that a boy breathing earth-tunneled vapors through a growing winter might carry effects nobody in the valley had lived long enough to measure. Permelia listened to both visits with the same flat patience, answering each concern with the same steady logic she'd used all along, but she noticed, without yet naming it as suspicion, Thane's worries always arrived precisely timed to whatever doubt was already softest in the valley's mind. The tampering began sometime in the first week of February, though Permelia wouldn't understand what she was looking at until nearly 2 weeks after the fact. She noticed first that the drainage sump at the tunnel's low point had begun holding water it shouldn't have held, a faint sheen visible even on days when no rain had fallen in nearly a week. She cleared the French drain herself, found nothing obviously wrong, chalked the moisture up to some seasonal seep she hadn't accounted for in her original grading. The second time the water reappeared, heavier now, she brought Marsh out to look at it, and the old mason crouched at the drain's daylighted mouth for a long while before he spoke, running his thumb along the packed earth in a way that made Permelia's stomach tighten before he'd said a single word. "Somebody's been at this drain," he said finally, straightening with the slow care of a man whose knees had outlived his patience for kneeling. "Packed clay in here tight as a plug, not natural settling ground don't do this to itself." Permelia stood over the drain, feeling something cold settle behind her ribs that had nothing to do with February air. Because a blocked drain in the coldest month of the year wasn't an inconvenience, it was a threat aimed directly at the structure's one true vulnerability, the same vulnerability that had nearly drowned her first attempt the previous summer. Someone had studied her failure closely enough to know exactly where to strike a second time. She said nothing of her suspicions that evening, not wanting to alarm Adeline, whose breathing had settled into an ease over the winter that Permelia guarded now like a second child. But she lay awake turning over every visitor the tunnel mouth had seen in recent weeks, every set of boots that might have crossed that ground after dark, and the name that kept surfacing, unwelcome but insistent, was the same name whose shop sat empty of customers while her own cabin stayed warm on nothing but sun and stone. It was Eli who found the proof his mother hadn't yet let herself look for. 2 nights after Marsh's visit, the boy woke before dawn to check on a rabbit snare he'd set along the tree line above the collector, and in the thin grate before sunrise he came across a set of boot pressed deep into the frost near the hillside mouth, prints that led away from the drain and toward the county road rather than toward any path a family member or neighbor would have taken. He followed them far enough to see they belonged to a man walking with purpose rather than wandering, the stride long and deliberate. And when he brought his mother out to see them before the morning sun could soften the frozen edges, Permelia crouched over the tracks with her jaw set in a line Eli had rarely seen on her before that morning. "Somebody's walking careful," she said, mostly to herself, tracing the print's edge with one gloved finger. Careful means they didn't want to be seen doing whatever they came to do. Eli, 11 years old and already learning the particular arithmetic of who benefited from his family's failure, asked the question his mother hadn't yet allowed herself to say aloud. "Is it Mr. Thane?" She didn't answer him directly, only told him to keep the tracks to him for now, that accusations without proof were a fire a person could burn their own house down with, but the seed of certainty had already taken root in both of them, and it would only need one more careless step to bloom into something neither Thane nor the valley could ignore. The market confrontation came at the end of February, on a day cold enough that most of the valley's business happened quickly, breath fogging between transactions, nobody lingering longer than the trade required. Permelia had come to sell surplus tallow and a length of forged hinges, and she found Thane's own cart, arranging stovepipe fittings with the studied casualness of a man performing normalcy for an audience. He greeted her with the same practiced warmth he always used, asked after Audlan's health with a solicitude that, knowing what she now suspected, sounded to Permelia like a man checking whether his handiwork had done any damage yet. She kept her voice level, pitched only for the two of them, though half the market stood within easy earshot. "Somebody's been packing clay into my drain, Mr. Thane, twice now." His face didn't so much as flicker, a stillness so complete it told her more than any confession could have. "Ground shift winner, Mrs. Ashcroft. Told you as much myself, more than once." She held his gaze a beat longer than comfort allowed, long enough that a few nearby faces turned to watch. "Ground don't pack clay into a French drain of its own accord. A man does that. A man who knows exactly where the weakness sits." Something tightened at the corner of his jaw, the first genuine crack she'd seen in his composure since the whole ordeal began, and when he spoke again the warmth had thinned to something harder underneath. "Careful what you say in a public market, ma'am. Accusations have a way of costing more than they collect." It wasn't a denial. Both of them understood it wasn't a denial, and Permelia walked away from the cart with her tallow unsold and a conviction settling into her chest as solid as any foundation stone she'd ever laid. Word of the market exchange reached Margaret Thane before her husband ever returned home that evening, carried by a neighbor eager to share it, and when Cornelius finally walked through his own door, she was waiting at the table with an expression he'd rarely seen on her in 21 years of marriage, somewhere between fury and fear. She did not raise her voice, which unsettled him more than shouting would have. "You told me the bank was the whole of it," she said. "You didn't tell me you'd been out sabotaging a widow's drain to buy us time." He had no answer that satisfied either of them that night, and it was the silence between them afterward, stretching on through supper and into the following days, that weighed on him nearly as heavily as the bank's letters did. That same week, Marsh made his position known before a wider audience than he'd ever addressed on the subject, speaking at the mill where half the valley's men gathered to have their corn ground and their gossip refreshed in equal measure. He hadn't been asked to weigh in, had simply grown tired, he said later, of listening to men who'd never laid a stone course in their lives pass judgment on work he'd examined with his own hands. "I've built foundations in this county 40 years, he told the room, his voice carrying easy over the mill's grinding. "That tunnel's cut true, drained right, stone tighter than half the cellars in this valley. Whatever's failing that girl, it ain't the masonry." The endorsement traveled fast, and though it didn't silence every doubter, it shifted the ground under the whole conversation, giving Permelia's defenders something solid to stand on besides her own word, giving her detractors, Thane chief among them, one fewer place to hide their doubt. Verity Longstreet, who had watched the whole dispute unfold from her particular vantage of practical neutrality, found herself drawn further onto Permelia's side than she'd expected to travel, less by conviction about the tunnel itself than by a growing distaste for what she'd started to suspect Thane was capable of. She brought the felt curtain she'd promised the previous autumn, finally finished, and while she fitted it to the interior damper, she spoke with unusual bluntness for a woman who generally kept her opinions to herself. "A man who'd sabotage a widow's drainage to save his own inventory ain't a man I care to keep buying stovepipe from," she said, tucking the last edge of felt into place. "Whatever I think about your hole in the ground, I know cruelty when I smell it, and that man reeks of it." It wasn't an apology for her earlier doubts, but it was, Permelia understood, something close to an alliance, forged not from belief in the tunnel but from a shared recognition of who was fighting fair and who wasn't. Reverend Prescott's position proved harder to shift. He continued to raise concerns from the pulpit through late winter, careful never to name Permelia directly, but pointed enough that no one in the congregations mistook his meaning, warning against the pride of those who trusted their own cleverness over the wisdom handed down through generations. His sermons drew genuine anxiety from a handful of younger mothers, women who had no particular stake in the dispute between Permelia and Thane, but who worried in the way new mothers worry about everything, whether unconventional choices carried unconventional dangers for children not their own to weigh. Permelia felt that particular current of judgment more sharply than Thane's outright sabotage, because a sabot could be caught and named, but a reverend's quiet disapproval settled into a community's bones in a way no single confrontation could dislodge. The construction itself, complete since November, required only maintenance through those tense winter months, which left Permelia more time than she wanted for turning over Thane's motives, for wondering whether a man cornered by debt might escalate beyond clay packed into a drain. She began walking the tunnel's full length each evening before dark, checking the collector's mica pane for cracks, the foundation damper for tampering, a vigilance that cost her sleep she couldn't easily spare with a forge to run and a mother's health to watch. Eli took to walking the perimeter with her, silent and watchful in a way that made her proud and afraid in equal measure, a boy learning too young that some threats wore a neighbor's face and rode a neighbor's wagon. She caught herself, more than once during those evening rounds, wishing she could spare him the particular education that came with watching your own mother stand guard against a grown man's desperation, and then reminding herself that the same education had made her who she was, and that there were worse things a boy could learn than how to stand his ground. There were nights that February when the vigilance felt almost absurd to her, a grown woman and her son creeping along their own property line as though guarding against wolves rather than a neighbor with a shop full of stovepipe, and she said as much to Eli one particularly cold evening, half hoping he'd laugh with her at the strangeness of it. He didn't laugh. "Wolves don't pretend to be your friend first," he said, young enough still to speak plainly about things adults usually learn to soften, and Permelia found she had no answer for that except to nod and keep walking. She noticed during those weeks how the boy had begun watching the county road itself with a wariness she'd never taught him directly, flinching faintly at the sound of any wagon that slowed near their property, and she understood with a mother's particular ache that some kinds of caution couldn't be untaught once a child had learned them, however necessary the lesson had been in the moment. Dr. Rowan, passing through on one of her regular rounds through the hollow, found Permelia and Eli mid-patrol one evening and walked the tunnel's length alongside them without being asked, listening to Permelia describe the pattern of the tampering with the same careful attention she gave a patient's symptoms. A man desperate enough to sabotage a widow twice is a man who's already decided he has nothing left to lose, Rowan said, crouching to examine the drain herself. Watch yourselves closer than you're watching the tunnel. Stone can be repaired. People can't always be. It was advice Permelia carried with her longer than she let on, tightening her own vigilance not just around the collector and the drain, but around the cabin itself, checking the door latch each night with a thoroughness she hadn't practiced since the earliest, hardest months after Amos died. It was during one of those evening rounds in the second week of March that mother and son together caught Thane in the act of the thing he'd only dared attempt in secret before. The night was clear, moonlight bright enough on old snow that Permelia had left her lantern unlit, and it was that unlit approach that let them come within 30 feet of the collector before Thane, crouched at the drain with a burlap sack of something dark clutched in one hand, heard the crunch of Eli's boot on crusted snow and spun to face them. For a long moment nobody spoke, the three of them frozen in moonlight. Thane's face caught somewhere between fury and the particular panic of a man discovered mid-crime with nowhere left to run the story. It was Eli who broke the silence first, his voice younger than his at 11 years but steadier than fear had any right to let it be. "You're the one that's been ruining our drain." Thane's composure, so carefully maintained through months of quiet sabotage, finally cracked wide open, and what spilled out wasn't confession but rage, the rage of a cornered man grasping for any ground left to stand on. "Your mother's fool contraption is bleeding my shop dry," he said, the words coming faster than he seemed able to control, his voice rising enough that it carried across the still winter air toward the cabin where Adeline lay sleeping. "Every stove I don't sell, every family that decides they don't need iron anymore because a widow dug a hole and got lucky, that's my children going hungry, same as yours would if I let it keep going." Permelia stepped forward then, placing herself between the man and her son with a motion so instinctive she barely registered making it, her voice dropping into a register colder than the March night around them. "Then you should have come to me honest, asked what I knew instead of creeping through my yard at midnight like a thief." Thane's jaw worked, the sack still clutched in his hand, its contents she'd learned later, a mixture of clay and ash meant to pack the drain tighter than water alone ever could have managed. "Honest, don't pay my note," he said, quieter now, something almost pleading beneath the anger. "Honest, don't keep the bank off my back come spring." She held his gaze, unflinching, and delivered the line that would follow her through the rest of that long, cold season, repeated later by half the valley in one form or another until it had nearly become proverb. A man drowning don't get to hold somebody else's head under just because he's scared of the water himself. The confrontation ended without violence, Thane retreating into the dark with his sack of ash and clay, his threats trailing behind him thin and unconvincing, but the damage to his standing in Sable Hollow was already done the moment Eli's voice had named him in front of witnesses close enough to matter, because Verity Longstreet's cabin sat close enough to the property line that her husband, roused by the raised voices, had stepped onto his own to hear the last of the exchange carry clear across the snow. Permelia said little to the boy on their walk back to the cabin, only rested a hand on his shoulder once they'd reached the door, feeling him trembling slightly beneath her palm, adrenaline finally catching up to a courage he'd summoned faster than his body could process. "You did right standing your ground," she told him, and he nodded without quite trusting his voice, yet the two of them standing together in the moonlit doorway a long moment before either moved to go inside. Permelia did not sleep well the nights that followed the confrontation, Replaying the moment Thane had spun to face them, the fury and panic tangled together on his face, and turning over in her mind exactly how close her son had come to danger she'd never fully anticipated when she'd first driven those stakes into the hillside 2 years before. She found herself more than once in the following week watching Eli a little too closely as he went about his chores, searching his face for signs the encounter had frightened him more deeply than his steady voice that night had let on. He surprised her when she finally asked him outright by saying that he'd been less as afraid than he expected to be, that standing beside her in that moonlight had felt less like danger and more like the natural conclusion of Tashunev's 2 years spent learning, stone by stone, exactly what his family was capable of defending when it needed to. News of the confrontation moved through the valley within 2 days, gaining detail and outrage with each retelling the way such stories always did, until by the following Sunday even Reverend Prescott found himself unable to raise his usual objections from the pulpit without first acknowledging, however obliquely, that whatever concerns remained about buried airpailed beside a grown man caught sabotaging a widow's drainage under cover of darkness. Broderick, who had mocked the loudest and longest, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having spent a year ridiculing a woman whose real enemy had turned out to be someone selling him his own stovepipe, and his silence on the matter afterward carried the particular weight of a man reassessing every certainty he'd built his opinions on. Thane did not appear publicly for nearly 2 weeks after the confrontation. His shop shuttered longer than Thane's business could easily absorb, and when he finally reopened, it was to a trickle of customers thinner even than the difficult winter had already left him. The Wheeling Bank's letters grew shorter and colder through March, the list stripped now of any pretense toward patience, and Permelia heard through Rowan, who treated patients across the whole county and heard everything eventually, that Thane had begun quietly inquiring about selling off part of his inventory just to keep the note from being called outright. She felt no triumph in the news, only a grim recognition that desperation, once it had shown its true shape, rarely retreated gracefully, that a man backed further into a corner might yet find one more desperate thing to attempt before the season turned. That final desperate thing arrived in the last week of March, though it took a different shape than the drain tampering had, born less of calculation than of raw panic. Thane rode out to Permelia's cabin in broad daylight this time, no pretense of neighborly concern left in his manner, his horse lathered from a hard ride, his voice cracking before he'd even swung down from the saddle. He had come, he told her, not to threaten but to beg, an admission that seemed to cost him more than any confession of sabotage had, because pride, she would understand later, had always the harder thing for a man like Thane to surrender than guilt. The bank's calling the note in full by May, he said, standing in her yard with his hat crushed between both hands, a posture so far removed from his earlier confidence that Permelia found herself almost unsettled by the change. I've got nothing left to sell that'll cover it. My wife don't know the whole of it yet. My boys don't know we might lose the shop, the house along with it. He looked at her then with an expression she hadn't expected to ever see on his face, something raw and unguarded, stripped of every careful calculation that had governed his behavior since the previous May. I know I've got no right asking you for anything. I know what I did to your drain, what I tried to do twice over, but I'm asking anyway, because I've got nowhere left to turn that ain't already turned me away. Permelia stood in her own doorway a long moment, weighing the man before her against the man who had crept through her yard at midnight with a sack of ash and clay, against the fear he'd tried to plant in Reverend Prescott's warnings, against the months of quiet cruelty dressed up as neighborly concern. She thought of her father's buried drawing, of the fear that had kept a good man from ever breaking ground on his own best idea, and something in her recognized, however unwillingly, a version of that same fear now sitting ruined in her own front yard. I can't fix your note, she told him finally, her voice carrying none of the warmth Thane might have hoped for, but none of the coldness he'd earned either. But I'll speak for your character before the bank if it comes to that. Tell them what kind of debt a man pays off with fear instead of sense. Won't erase what you did, but it might buy you room to do better. Thane's throat worked visibly, whatever he'd expected from this visit, clearly not this measured, unsentimental grace, and he left without further words, only a nod that carried more gratitude than his pride would let him voice aloud. The offer proved less necessary than either of them expected, because within days Marsh, of all people, arrived at Thane's shuttered shop with a proposal that surprised the whole valley when word of it eventually spread. The old mason, whose endorsement had already shifted so much opinion towards Permelia's side, saw in Thane's collapsing shop an opportunity neither man had considered, a partnership in which Thane's remaining stove inventory could be sold alongside a new trade, supplying stone, mica panes, and forged dampers to the handful of neighboring families who had begun quietly asking Permelia whether a version of her tunnel might work on their own land. It was not charity so much as shrewd necessity on both sides, Marsh recognizing a market forming around a technology he understood better than anyone, Permelia herself. Thane recognizing that survival sometimes required trading pride for partnership with the very innovation that had nearly ruined him. Margaret wept openly the evening he told her the note would be covered, less from relief over the money itself than from watching her husband speak of the arrangement without a trace of the old bitterness he'd carried through the winter, as though some weight he'd hauled for months had finally been set down where it belonged. By the time April's thaw softened the ground enough for new digging, 3 families beyond Permelia's own had begun surveying their land for south-facing slope. Guided by rough notes Permelia herself had started sharing. Notes that would eventually grow into the same principles Marsh, and even grudgingly Thane would help spread across the county in years to come. It was a smaller vindication than the one still waiting 16 winters ahead, but it was real, tangible, measured in trench stakes driven into thawing earth by hands that had mocked her only a season before. Adeline's health continued its steady improvement through that spring, the whistle in her chest fading to something Rowan pronounced nearly negligible by the time the first wildflowers pushed up along Sable Creek, and it was on one of those warming April mornings, sitting together on the cabin's east-facing step with coffee going cold in their hands, that Adeline finally said aloud the thing she'd apparently been turning over since the confrontation with Thane. "You could have let that man drown," she said, watching Eli chase a barn cat across the yard with an energy Permelia hadn't seen in him since before his father's death. "Nobody in this valley would have blamed you for it." Permelia considered the question longer than her mother probably expected, watching her son's careless laughter carry across the yard, thinking of buried drawings and buried fears and the particular cruelty of watching a man's desperation curdle into sabotage before it finally broke into something closer to shame. "Maybe not," she said finally, "but I didn't dig that tunnel to prove I was right. I dug it so this family could breathe easier come winter. Seemed a poor use of that lesson, letting somebody else suffocate just because I finally could." The summer that followed passed with a quiet Permelia hadn't experienced in over a year, the tunnel requiring only routine maintenance, the valley's opinion of her settling into something closer to grudging respect than open mockery, though old habits died slower in some mouths than others. Kettle still muttered occasionally that one mild winter and one strange spring proved nothing about what true Appalachian cold might yet demand of an earthen tunnel, and there was buried under his stubbornness a kernel of truth neither he nor Permelia could yet disprove, because the winter of 1883 to 1884 had been, by every measure the valley's older residents could recall, an unremarkable one, cold enough to test conventional hearths, but nowhere near the outer edge of what Randolph County's mountains were capable of delivering when the true Arctic reached down from Canada with nothing to stop it. Permelia herself never argued the point when Kettle raised it, understanding that a design proven only against ordinary winters would always carry an asterisk in the minds of men who'd built their whole world view on withstanding the extraordinary kind. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she agreed with the shape of his doubt even while disagreeing with its conclusion. She kept her ledger not to silence him but because she genuinely wanted to know, the same patient curiosity that had first sent her walking the south slope with a level line now turned toward the long, unglamorous work of simply watching and recording year after year, waiting to see what the mountains would eventually ask of her design and whether it would answer. Permelia kept her ledger through that second winter and the winters after, temperatures logged with the same discipline that had first proven her design sound, watching her numbers hold steady year after year while her neighbor's fuel consumption told its own quieter story of comparison. Word of the tunnel traveled beyond Sable Hollow gradually, carried by traders and circuit preachers, and the occasional curious traveler who'd heard rumor of a widow's underground heating system somewhere in the Randolph County hills, though it would be years yet before the design found the kind of wider adoption that true catastrophe alone seemed capable of forcing into being. Marsh grew older through those years, his hands stiffening with a rheumatism that eventually slowed his stonework, though he never stopped visiting Permelia's tunnel each autumn to run his palm along the parched walls, checking for settlement, for cracks, for any sign the earth had finally begun to reclaim what she'd carved from it. Eli grew from an 11-year-old boy hauling clay in his grandfather's barrow into a young man who had absorbed, almost without noticing, the full weight of what his mother had built and defended, a young man who could recite the tunnel's grade and gravel depth from memory the way other boys his age recited scripture. He courted a girl from the far side of the ridge for 2 seasons in his late teens before she moved with her family to Ohio, and though the loss stung him for a while, Permelia noticed that he never once complained about these slim prospects the way other young men his age did, seeming instead to have inherited her own particular patience, the sense that a thing worth having was usually worth waiting to build right. Adeline lived to see 3 more winters pass in relative comfort before a different illness, unrelated to the lungs that the tunnel had helped preserve, finally took her in the spring of 1887, and Permelia buried her mother on the same south-facing slope where the collector's mica pane still caught the morning sun, a placement Adeline had requested herself in her final lucid days, wanting, she said, to keep warming the family even after she'd stopped needing warmth for herself. In those last weeks, weak as she'd grown, Adeline had asked more than once to be carried out to sit beside the collector box in the afternoon sun, content simply to feel its warmth on her face while Italy, 15 by then and taller than his mother, sat beside her reading aloud from whatever book the circuit library had last brought through the valley. Permelia found in the years after that she could not pass the collector on a bright afternoon without some part of her still expecting to find her mother's chair set beside it, and she never moved the worn patch of ground where that chair had once rested, letting the grass grow up around it the way grass grows up around anything a family has decided to leave undisturbed. Thane's shop survived, transformed by necessity into something closer to a supply post for the earth and heating systems spreading slowly across the county, his partnership with Marsh deepening into something that, while never quite friendship, carried the particular respect of 2 men who had once stood on opposite sides of an argument and lived long enough to watch the argument settle itself. He never fully apologized to Permelia in words, but each spring he sent a boy out to her property with a small delivery of hardware at no charge, hinges or nails, or the occasional length of stovepipe she hadn't asked for, a gesture neither of them ever named aloud but both understood as a debt being paid down, slow and quiet, 1 season at a time. His own sons grew up in that shop the way Eli had grown up at the forge, and the elder boy in particular took a keen interest in the tunnel principles his father now supplied materials for, though Thane himself, for reasons he never fully explained even to Margaret, put off year after year the notion of digging one for his own household, telling himself each autumn that next spring would be soon enough. By 1898, Permelia Ashcroft stood on the far side of 50, her hair gone gray at the temples, her hands still strong from decades at the forge, though the winters had begun settling into her joints the way they settled into every laborer's body eventually. The tunnel that had once drawn the whole valley's ridicule had become, in the years since, an unremarkable fixture of the landscape, its stone mouth weathered smooth, its mica pane replaced twice, but its principle unchanged, still drawing sun-warmed air down through 40 feet of earth and stone to keep her cabin livable through whatever winter chose to send. She had watched, in the years since Thane's confrontation, 4 more families in the valley build their own versions of her system, each one a little different, adapted to its own slope and soil, but every one of them tracing the lineage back to a set of stakes she'd driven into a hillside 15 years before, back to a drawing her father had been too afraid to dig. What none of them could yet know, standing in the ordinary comfort of an ordinary autumn, was that the true test her design had waited 16 years to face was already gathering itself far to the north, in the cold Canadian air beginning its long, slow drift southward, building toward a February that would arrive with a violence the whole valley's collective memory had never once recorded, a cold that would find every weakness in every Hearth Randolph County had ever trusted and leave standing, in the end, only the one system built not on tradition but on the patient, stubborn logic of a woman who had once been told that heat could never be persuaded to travel downhill. The high-pressure system that would later fill Weather Bureau ledgers with numbers nobody in Randolph County had ever recorded began building over the Canadian prairies in the last days of January 1899, though nothing in the valley's ordinary rhythms gave warning of what was gathering itself so far to the north. Permelia Ashcroft, 58 years old now, her joints stiffer each autumn but her hands still sure at the forge, had spent that January the way she'd spent every January for the past decade and a half, tending her tunnel's small routine maintenance, watching her ledger's familiar numbers hold their familiar pattern, unaware that the pattern was about to be tested against something no living memory in the hollow could measure against. Eli Ashcroft, 26 now, had grown into a man who split his time between his mother's forge and a modest cabin of his own a half-mile up the creek, built with his own hands 2 summers passed on ground he'd surveyed for a south-facing slope before he'd ever laid a foundation stone, a habit so thoroughly inherited from his mother that he'd never thought to question why he did it. He had not yet dug his own tunnel, a project he kept promising himself for the following spring, having spent the intervening summers instead helping his mother teach the principle to newer ham families, always somehow finding a reason to put his own version off another season. There would be reason enough before February ended to regret every season he'd delayed it. The first warning reached the valley through a Weather Bureau notice posted at the county seat on the 7th of February, terse language describing a mass of Arctic air moving faster and colder than any system on record. But warnings posted on a courthouse wall meant little lieu to families already settled into their winter patterns. Hearth banks measured against what they'd always considered a generous margin. 16 years of ordinary winters had taught the valley a kind of complacency no single notice could easily undo, and most families who heard rumor of the warning on second hand simply nodded and went about the business of the week, assuming, as people generally do, that the worst weather anyone could remember was the worst weather they were likely to see again. Eli heard the warning from a trader passing through with dry goods, and though he mentioned it to his mother that same evening, neither of them yet understood how directly it would come to bear on the tunnel he'd been meaning to dig for 3 summers running. He had told himself the previous spring that he'd break ground as soon as his own planting was done, then told himself the same thing again come autumn, always with a good enough reason to explain the delay, a reason that felt in retrospect thinner each time he was forced to repeat it to himself. Cornelius Thane read the notice himself while delivering hardware to a customer near the courthouse, and something in the wording, the word unprecedented used twice in 3 sentences, settled into his stomach with a weight that made him drive home faster than the icy road strictly allowed. He thought, riding hard through the gathering dusk, of his own hearth, rebuilt and improved over the years but never once fitted with the very system he'd spent a decade and a half helping other families install, and something cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled into his chest alongside the more obvious worry. By the 9th of February, the sky over Sable Hollow had taken on the flat iron color that old-timers claimed always preceded the worst weather, a grayness so total it seemed to swallow the last light from the ridgelines an hour before true sunset. Permelia walked her tunnel's length that evening with a lantern, checking the damper, the collector's mica pane, the drainage sump, a ritual she'd performed thousands of times across 16 years, though something in the wind's particular bite made her linger longer than usual at the hillside mouth, running her palm along the hard stone as if reassuring herself or her tunnel itself that both of them were ready for whatever the sky intended to send. The cold arrived in full on the 10th of February, dropping so fast and so far that families across 3 counties would later describe the sensation as the air itself turning to iron, a cold that didn't simply lower temperatures but seemed to reach directly through wall and window and flesh with a hostility no ordinary winter had ever carried. Staunton's official reading fell to 12 below zero within the first 24 hours. Further into the highlands, Monterey registered 29 below, a number the Weather Bureau's own observer described in his log as scarcely believable, even as he wrote it down with his own frost-numbed hand. Sable Hollow, tucked into its own fold of the Randolph County mountains, saw its thermometers plunge to depths nobody present could recall witnessing in a lifetime of winters. Silas Broderick, now well past 60, fed his rebuilt hearth through that first night with the confidence of a man who had spent 40 years perfecting exactly this kind of defense. His firebox glowing red behind an improved 12 by 12 flue he'd rebuilt with his own hands years before, certain that generations of accumulated wisdom would carry his family through whatever the sky could throw at them. By the second morning, the 11th of February, that confidence had begun to crack along the same lines his stonework soon would, his cabin's interior holding stubbornly in the low 40s despite a fire he hadn't let die down even for an hour, his wife wrapping their grandchildren in every quilt the house possessed while frost crept visibly across the inside of the window panes. Ambrose Kettle's stove, doubled in stovepipe length and fitted with the tin heat shedder he'd installed with such pride years before, proved no match for what the third day demanded of it. He burned wood at a rate that would have seemed impossible to imagine only a week earlier, half a cord disappearing into the firebox between dawn and dusk, and still his water bucket developed a skin of ice by morning. Still his children slept in their coats. Still the cold found every gap his careful chinking had left unsealed. His wife kept the younger 2 children pressed close against her own body through the second night, sharing warmth the way animals share a den, while Kettle himself paced the small cabin, checking and rechecking the stove door as though sheer vigilance might coax more heat from the same dwindling wood. He stood in his own doorway that third night, staring out at a sky scoured clean of cloud, star-bright and merciless, and felt for the first time in 16 years the particular fear his own mockery had once denied to a woman digging stakes into a hillside, a fear that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with watching his own children's breath fog visible in the air of a room he could not warm no matter what he burned. Verity Longstreet's cook stove cycled between glowing red and stone cold through those same brutal days, her carefully layered quilts and chinked walls, adequate for every ordinary winter she'd survived, proving helpless against a cold that seemed to treat conventional shelter as a mere suggestion rather than a genuine barrier. By the second night, she had moved her whole family, husband and children both, into a single room around the stove, feeding it continuously through hours she should have spent sleeping, watching the thermometer refused to climb no matter how much fuel she committed to the fight. Her husband, still weak in his injured arm even after so many years, could do little but feed her wood as fast as she asked for it. And she found herself somewhere past midnight the second night, thinking of Permelia stakes driven into a hillside 15 years before with something far closer to envy than she'd ever admit aloud. Through all of it, Permelia's tunnel performed with the same unhurried consistency it had shown every winter since 1883, gripping the rest of the valley, her cabin holding between 58 and 62 degrees through the worst of the outbreak's opening days without a single log needing to burn beyond what her cook stove required for meals. She recorded the numbers each evening in the same ledger she'd kept for 16 years, her handwriting steadier than the trembling cold outside might have suggested it should be. And there was something almost eerie in the quiet of her cabin during those days, a stillness that felt less like triumph than like standing at the eye of a storm everyone else was drowning in. Eli arrived on the second morning of the outbreak, having walked the half-mile from his own cabin through drifts that reached his knees in places, his face windburned raw despite every scarf he'd wrapped against it. And when Permelia opened her door to him, the warmth that spilled out into the frozen yard visibly startled him, even though he'd grown up inside that same warmth his whole life. "My place is holding at 38, he said, his voice rough from the cold, stamping snow from his boots with hands that shook slightly from more than exertion. "I've burned through wood I meant to last me the whole month." She pulled him inside without hesitation, settling him near the foundation vent where the stones still radiated the day's accumulated heat. And it was there, watching her grown son thaw in front of a heat source that had cost him nothing but his mother's stubbornness 16 years earlier, that the full weight of what she'd built finally settled into something neither of them had words for yet. "Ought to have dug my own years back," Eli admitted quietly, watching the color return to his own hands. "Kept telling myself next spring, same as everybody else in this valley did once." The third day brought the storm's first true crisis to the valley, a fire at the Kettle homestead when an overstoked chimney threw sparks into a roof gone brittle with cold, a blaze that consumed the family's woodshed before neighbors could reach it through the drifts to help, leaving Ambrose Kettle and his family with less fuel than they'd had that morning and a full week of Arctic cold still ahead of them. Word of the fire reached Permelia by midday, carried by a rider whose horse had struggled visibly through snow deep enough to slow even a determined animal, and she felt the old instinct rise in her before she'd fully decided to act on it, the same instinct that had once made her kneel beside her mother's chair and promise not to bury anyone else's fear. She sent Eli to the Kettle place with what dry wood she could spare from her own modest stockpile, a stockpile so much smaller than her neighbor's that the gesture cost her almost nothing to give, and it was Ambrose Kettle himself, standing amid the ruin of his woodshed with his children shivering behind him, who finally said aloud what 16 years of grudging silence had kept buried. "Tell your mother I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking on words that plainly cost him more than the wood ever could have. "Tell her I was wrong the whole time, and I'm sorry it took near freezing my own family to see it." Eli carried the message home through the same brutal drifts he'd crossed that morning, and Permelia received it without triumph, only a tired nod, because vindication, she understood by then, tasted very little like she'd once imagined it would. The fourth day, the 13th of February, brought the outbreak's deepest cold to Sable Hollow, temperatures the valley's oldest residents would later swear had never been matched in living memory, and it was on this day that Cornelius Thane's household, 21 years married with 2 sons still at home, faced the crisis that would finally settle, once and for all, the argument that had begun with a set of stakes driven into a hillside so many winters before. Thane's own hearth, rebuilt and improved across the years he'd spent partnering with Marsh to supply materials for the valley's spreading network of earthen tunnels, had never received the same treatment for his own home, a bitter irony he would later admit to more than once. He had spent so many years helping other families build what he himself had once sabotaged that he'd never found the time, or perhaps never quite forgiven himself enough to dig his own. His shop's inventory, still substantial despite the changed business, sat useless against a cold that didn't care how much iron a man owned, only how efficiently that iron could fight a battle it had never been designed to win. By the fourth night, Thane's cabin had fallen to temperatures that left his wife, Margaret, weeping openly over their youngest son, a boy of 9 whose lips had taken on a blue tinge that both burned any argument about pride or business ever could. Their eldest son, 17 and strong enough to have made the attempt himself, set out on foot toward the county seat seeking help. But the drifts defeated him within the first quarter mile, forcing a retreat that left the family with no remaining option beyond enduring or seeking shelter somewhere the cold hadn't yet claimed victory. It was Thane himself who finally made the decision no pride could argue him out of any longer, wrapping his failing son in every blanket the house possessed, loading his family onto the one sled his horses could still pull through drifts that had stopped nearly everyone else's travel entirely, and turning that sled not toward the county seat, too far now to reach safely, but toward the one cabin in the whole valley he knew for certain was holding warm against a cold that had broken every hearth it had tested. He arrived at Permelia's door past midnight on the 5th day of the outbreak, his voice raw from cold and fear both, pounding against wood he'd once stood outside sabotaging in secret. "Permelia, please," he called out, the please costing him everything his old pride had once protected. "My boy's turning blue. I've got nowhere else left that's warm." She opened the door before he'd finished the sentence, the warmth of her cabin spilling out into a night cold enough to sting exposed skin within seconds, and there was no hesitation in her at all, no accounting of old grievances weighed against the shivering family on her step. She pulled Margaret and the boys inside first, settling the youngest near the foundation vent where the stone held its patient, banked heat, calling for Eli, who had been staying with her through the worst of the outbreak, to help get blankets and warmed broth moving fast enough to matter. Only once the boy's lips had begun to lose their blue did she turn to look at Thane himself, still standing half in the doorway as though uncertain he'd earned the right to cross the threshold he'd once tried to undermine from the outside. 16 years, she said, not unkindly, though the weight of everything between them sat plain in her voice. 16 years, and you never dug your own. Thane's face, wind-burned and exhausted, crumpled with something closer to grief than shame. "Couldn't bring myself to," he admitted, stepping finally inside, pulling the door shut behind him against the killing cold. "Every time I picked up a shovel, I remembered what I did to yours, and I figured I didn't deserve the same comfort I'd tried to steal from you." She studied him a long moment, the boy's breathing steadying behind her, the whole weight of 16 years condensing into a single decision she made without needing to think it through twice. "Comfort ain't something you earn by being good enough, Cornelius. It's something you build, same as anybody. Warm up. Argue with your pride some other night." The Thane family stayed through the worst 2 days of the outbreak, sleeping on pallets near the foundation vent, while the deepest cold the valley had ever recorded raged outside, and it was during those 48 oath hours, forced into close quarters with the woman he'd once tried to ruin, that Cornelius Thane finally spoke the full truth he'd never quite managed 16 years before. He told her in halting pieces across 2 long nights about the ash and clay, about the calculated visits designed to plant doubt exactly where it would take deepest root, about the particular shame of watching his son Sabotage nearly cost a widow her home before it ever cost him anything real. "I was drowning," he said, echoing without seeming to realize it the very words she'd once thrown back at him in her own yard. "And I tried to hold your head under so I wouldn't have to feel it happening to me alone." Margaret, listening from where she sat with their sleeping youngest cradled against her shoulder, said nothing, though her eyes on her husband carried a weight of their own, the particular look of a woman learning, 16 years late, the full shape of a fear her husband had carried alone rather than share with her. She thought, listening to him, of her own father's buried drawing, of the particular way fear could curdle a good man's judgment until he mistook cowardice for prudence, and she found herself less angry at Thane in that moment than she might have expected. Understanding, however, unwillingly, that the line between his sabotage and her father's silence was thinner than either man would have wanted to admit. Both had let fear make their decisions for them, only the shape of the fear had differed. Permelia listened to all of it without interrupting, feeding the fire in her small cook stove, checking on his sleeping sons with the same practical care she'd once given her own boy at that age, and when Thane finally finished, she offered him nothing so simple as forgiveness dressed up as absolution. "You already paid part of it down," she said, thinking of the 16 years of hardware delivered quietly each spring, the partnership with Marsh that had helped a dozen families across the county build systems that would now, in this brutal week, be the only thing standing between their children and the same fate his own son had nearly suffered. "Rest of it you'll keep paying, same as anybody carries a debt. But you're warm tonight because I decided a grudge wasn't worth more than your boy's life. Try to remember that's a debt too next time somebody else's success feels like your own failure." The 5th and final day of the outbreak's worst cold, the 14th of February, brought the valley its clearest sky since the crisis began, brilliant winter sun striking down across drifts that sparkled hard as broken glass. And it was on the day that Permelia's tunnel delivered its most dramatic proof yet. Her cabin's temperature climbing to 65 degrees on nothing but sunlight and stone. No fire required at all, while news filtered in from across the valley of the damage the preceding days had left behind. 2 families had lost sections of clay lime chinking where thermal cycling had cracked it beyond repair. Broderick discovered a sheared chimney stone where frost expansion had finally overcome even his rebuilt masonry's tensile strength. Multiple cabins reported interior wall damage where trapped condensation had frozen and split the very timber that was supposed to keep families safe. The roads reopened enough for travel by the following morning, and what emerged in the days after was a valley forced to reckon, all at once and in the starkest possible terms, with 2 centuries of heating wisdom that had simply failed against a test severe enough to expose its limits. The Weather Bureau's own official documentation, published in regional papers within the week, confirmed what every family in Sable Hollow already knew from bitter freezing experience, that the outbreak had shattered every prior record for sustained Arctic cold in the region's recorded history, a fact that lent Permelia's 16 years of careful ledger-keeping a weight no amount of neighborly stubbornness could argue away any longer. The valley gathered the following Sunday in numbers Reverend Prescott's small church rarely saw outside of Christmas, families still hollow-eyed from the week's ordeal filling every pew and lining the walls behind them, and it was there, before the whole assembled congregation rather than in the privacy of any single cabin, that Cornelius Thane finally stood and spoke the confession he had, until that morning, only ever managed in fragments behind closed doors. He rose from his pew unbidden, Margaret's hand tight around his own. When Prescott paused mid-sermon to let him speak, Thane's voice carried clear to the back wall, none of the careful salesman's polish left in it at all. Most of you know by now that I packed clay into Permelia Ashcroft's drain not once but twice, tried to see her family fail so mine wouldn't, he said, and the church went silent enough that the crackle of the stove at the front seemed suddenly loud. She opened her door to my boy anyway, the coldest night any of us have ever lived through, and I mean to spend whatever years I've got left proving I understood what she gave me that night better than I understood anything before it. He sat back down before anyone could answer him, and it was Broderick, of all people, who broke the silence that followed, rising from his own pew to say, in a voice rough with more feeling than the valley was used to hearing from him, that a man brave enough to confess that before his years deserved to be judged by what he did next, rather than what he'd already done. Margaret sat beside her husband through the whole of that Sunday service, without once letting go of his hand, and though several of the women to anyone who emerged that something in her posture, like the straightness of her back, the steadiness of her gaze, the church carried more pride than shame, the particular pride of a woman who had watched her husband finally choose honesty over the comfortable silence he'd hidden behind for 16 years. Broderick came to Permelia's cabin himself within the week, though this time his wagon carried none of its old swagger, his hat held in both hands the way Thane's had been held months before. He stood at Permelia's hillside collector studying the weathered mica pane with an expression that mixed genuine curiosity with something close to grief for all the years he'd spent mocking it instead of asking. Near lost my whole family to the cold I bragged about beating for 40 years, he said, running a hand along the collector's blackened wood. Reckon I owe you more than an apology, Permelia. I owe you the truth, which is I never once understood what I was laughing at. She showed him the grade markers, the gravel bed, the same patient explanation she'd given so many doubters across 16 years, and this time he listened with the full attention of a man whose certainty had finally completely run out. Kettle followed within days, his questions no longer laced with the old mockery, but sharpened instead into genuine technical curiosity, asking about stone thickness and drainage fall with the focused urgency of a man determined never again to watch his children shiver through a preventable cold. He had lost his woodshed to fire and nearly lost his family to frost in the same brutal week, and the lesson had settled into him with a permanence that made his earlier decades of doubt seem, even to himself, like a stubbornness he could no longer afford to indulge. Verity Longstreet arrived on a quieter errand than the others, needing no confession of her own to make, since she'd long since crossed over to Permelia's side of the argument, but she came anyway, sitting with Permelia at the same table where the felt curtain had once been fitted to the interior damper, and admitted, in her own clipped fashion, that she'd spent the whole outbreak wondering whether her husband's ruined arm would finally cost them everything the cold hadn't already claimed. "We made it through," she said, turning her cup in her hands the way Rowan so often did. "Barely. I'm done making it through barely. Show me what I need to dig." Permelia walked her through the grade and the gravel that same afternoon, and within the month Verity's own husband, one good arm and all, had begun clearing stakes along their own south-facing rise, determined that no future winter would ever again come as close to breaking them as this one had. Thane's eldest son, the 17-year-old who had tried and failed to walk to the county seat for help on the outbreak's worst night, took to spending his afternoons at Permelia's tunnel that spring, watching her work with an attentiveness that reminded her, and more than once, by early summer, he had all but apprenticed himself to both her and Marsh together, determined, he said plainly, that his own future household would never again depend on a hearth alone to keep his children breathing through a February like the one he'd just survived. Doctor. Rowan's involvement took a different shape than the others, born not of personal crisis but of the professional horror she'd witnessed across 5 days of tending families whose hearths had failed them, children with frostbitten kitten fingers, elderly patients whose lungs had suffered under smoke-heavy heating, pushed past any reasonable limit in a desperate bid for warmth. She arrived at Permelia's cabin not to ask forgiveness but to ask for help, wanting to understand whether a version of the tunnel might be adapted for her own small medical office in the county seat, where she treated exactly the kind of respiratory suffering that clean, consistent, earth-warmed might finally begin to prevent. I've watched this valley bury children for reasons that had everything to do with bad air and nothing to do with bad luck, she said, standing at the tunnel mouth with the same directness she'd carried into every conversation Permelia had ever had with her. If your system can save even a fraction of what I've buried these 15 years, I intend to learn every inch of how it works. Reverend Prescott's reckoning proved the slowest of all. His doctrinal concerns about buried unnatural air tangled up across 16 years with a pride he found harder to surrender than most, but even he arrived eventually, drawn less by personal crisis than by the accumulated weight of a congregation that had, almost to a family, suffered through the outbreak in homes his own warnings had helped keep tunnel free. He found Permelia at her forge, working iron for Emperor some neighboring family had requested, and he stood in the doorway a long moment before he found the words his pride had been withholding. I preached against your tunnel from my own pulpit, he said, and I did it thinking I was protecting children from a danger I never once bothered to verify. Meanwhile, half this valley's children spent last week sleeping in coats because I never once questioned whether the danger I feared was worse than the one I ignored. He asked in the end about adapting the design for the schoolhouse, a project that would occupy the following summer's labor and stand within 2 years as the first public build in the county to draw Worcester heat from beneath the earth rather than from wood cut above it. Prescott himself took up a shovel more than once during that summer's digging, an unusual sight for a man of his station. And he told anyone who asked that a minister who preached against a thing without ever testing it owed his congregation at least this much penance. Working alongside the very families whose children would someday sit warm in that schoolhouse because of a labor he'd once tried to talk them out of allowing. By the time the schoolhouse tunnel was tested that October, its cold air collector angled toward the same reliable southern exposure Permelia had first identified 15 years earlier. Prescott stood at the ceremony not as a skeptic finally converted, but something closer to a co-builder, having earned, through his own blistered hands, a place in the story he'd once only preached against. Ezekiel Marsh, now well past 70, his hands too stiff for the fine he'd once been making for, took particular satisfaction in the valley's collective reckoning, having spent 16 years defending a design he'd verified with his own hands long before the rest of the hollow found reason to believe it. He and Thane, partners now in more than just hardware supply, spent that spring traveling together to a dozen homesteads across South River and into the Deerfield Valley, Marsh advising on grade and stone while Thane supplied materials at prices that barely covered his own costs. A quiet penance he never named aloud, but that everyone who knew the full history understood exactly for what it was. The variations that spread across the county in the years following the outbreak carried Permelia's core principles into form she herself had never anticipated, each builder adapting the design to local terrain and available skill, some featuring longer runs that took advantage of particularly favorable south-facing slopes, others incorporating double intakes that increased airflow capacity for larger farmhouses housing extended families. A stonemason working near the county's eastern edge, trained in part by Marsh himself, extended the public use entirely, cutting a 60-foot tunnel with dual air paths to warm a church hall that no domestic system could have adequately served, his professional execution demonstrating to skeptical craftsmen throughout the region that the principles Permelia had first proven on a single hillside scaled effectively to structures far larger than any cabin. Permelia herself, in the years following the outbreak, found herself an unlikely authority sought out by families from counties she'd never before had reason to visit. Her ledger's 16 years of carefully decided now, not as curiosity but as proof. Her explanation of grade and thermal mass and stack effect, delivered so many times across so many kitchen tables that she could recite it. Eli sometimes teased her, the way Reverend Prescott recited scripture. She never charged for the knowledge itself, though she accepted the hardware and labor Thane's shop increasingly provided at cost. Understanding that a debt repaid slowly across years carried its own particular integrity that a single grand gesture never could have matched. Eli finally dug his own tunnel that same spring, working alongside his mother with the same patient precision she'd taught him as a boy hauling clay in his grandfather's barrow, the two of them falling back into the old rhythm of grade and gravel and stone as easily as though 16 years had not passed since the last time they'd worked a trench together. And when he struck the sulfur match at his own collector's mouth that October, watching the smoke thread inward and emerge, minutes later from his own ridge vent, he understood in a way words had never quite managed to convey exactly what his mother had built, and defended and nearly lost across the better part of 2 decades. Grandpa drew it and never dug it, he said to her that evening, echoing words he'd first spoken as an 11-year-old boy standing over an unfinished trench. You dug it and nearly drowned twice trying to prove it. I dug mine standing on both your shoulders, and it still took me 16 years to get brave enough to start. Permelia, gray-haired now and watching her son's cabin warm without a single log burning, felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the day she'd first found her father's buried oilcloth drawing. That's the whole difference between fear passed down and fear finally spent, she told him. Every generation gets to choose which one it hands to the next. She said it plainly, without any particular weight of ceremony, though both of them understood, standing together in the warm doorway of a cabin heated by nothing but sun and patient stone, that the words carried the whole of what the last 16 years had been building toward. The years that followed carried Permelia into a quieter kind of legacy than the dramatic vindication of that single brutal February, her tunnels still holding steady each winter, her ledger still filling with numbers that had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. Cornelius Thane's shop, transformed permanently now into a supply post for a technology he'd once tried to distrust, eventually to his surviving son, the same boy whose blue lips had finally broken through Thane's pride on the worst night of the outbreak, and the young man grew up understanding the tunnel's principles as thoroughly as he understood his own family's history of nearly losing everything to a cold his father's stubbornness had almost let win. Marsh died in the winter of 1901, 2 years after the great outbreak, warm in a cabin whose foundation he himself had helped Permelia grade decades before, and at his funeral, held in the same schoolhouse whose earthen heating system he'd helped design in his final working years, Permelia stood beside Thane and Eli and Dr. Rowan, 4 people whose paths had crossed across 16 years of doubt and sabotage and finally hard-won trust, watching a valley bury the man who had first told a scorned widow that stone laid right could keep weather like a cave. The schoolhouse itself stood warm that day without a single fire lit despite the January cold outside, its own tunnel drawing sun and earth heat, exactly as Marsh had helped design it, and more than one person in the gathered crowd remarked quietly that there was no more fitting room in the whole county for a stone ensign to be remembered in, a building that would keep warming children for generations after his hands had gone still. It was Rowan who spoke the words that closed the service, words that would be repeated across Randolph County for years after, carried by families who'd never known Marsh personally but who understood, through their own warm cabins each winter, exactly what his craft had made possible. Some men build monuments, she said, standing in a building warmed by earth and sun rather than fire. And some men build the quiet buried things that outlast every monument anybody ever thought to carve. Eli married, in the years that followed, a schoolteacher who had come to Sable Hollow to run classes in the very building his mother's tunnel principles had helped warm, and the 2 of them raised 3 children in the cabin he'd built with his own hands beside his own tunnel, each child learning to sight a level line and read a spirit level's bubble before they'd learned much else about the world outside the valley. Permelia took particular joy in her grandchildren's earliest visits to the original tunnel. Watching them press small palms against the same warm foundation stone she and Eli had once pressed their own hands against on that first triumphant October afternoon, a ritual repeating itself now across a 3rd generation without any of them needing to be told why it mattered. The eldest of those grandchildren, a girl named after Adeline, grew up hearing the whole story told and retold at the supper table until she could recite it herself: the flood, the willow switch, the moonlit confrontation, the night Cornelius Thane pounded on a door he'd once tried to ruin, and she took to asking her grandmother, more than once, why nobody in the valley had thought of it sooner, if the ground truly held so much patient warmth. Permelia never had a tidy answer for that question, only telling the girl that most people needed to lose something before they'd trust a stranger's certainty over their own, and that she herself had only ever trusted it because losing had already taught her what waiting to trust something new could cost. The girl grew in time to dig a tunnel of her own on a homestead further north along the South River, carrying family's buried inheritance 1 generation further than even Permelia had lived to see. In her final years, Permelia took to spending her quieter afternoons at the forge, less for the work itself than for the company of it, teaching a new generation of Sable Hollow children, her own grandchildren among them, the same lessons in patience her father had once taught her, how a blade quenched too fast would crack along a seam no eye could catch until it mattered most, how the ground beneath a person's feet held more forgiveness than most people ever thought to ask of it. She never spoke often of the years of ridicule that had once surrounded her, finding little use in dwelling on doubts long since settled, though she kept her father's oilcloth drawing folded in the same drawer where she now kept her own 16 years of ledgers, a private reminder of the distance between a fear buried and a fear finally spent. By the time Permelia Ashcroft died in the winter of 1911, 71 years old, warm in the same cabin where she'd once knelt beside her mother's chair and promised not to bury anyone else's fear, her tunnel had spread in variation across 3 counties, its principles taught now in the same schoolhouse Reverend Prescott had helped convert. Its inventor remembered less as the widow who'd once been mocked for digging a hole to nowhere than as the woman who had proven, through 16 patient years and one unforgiving February, that the earth remembered summer longer than any man remembered winter, exactly as her own father had once written and buried, too afraid to test his own certainty against a valley's ridicule. Eli buried his mother on the same south-facing slope where she'd buried Ottiline before her, collector's mica panes still catching morning sun just above the grave, and he spent the following decades doing precisely what she'd once told him mattered most, carrying her design not as a monument frozen in memory, but as a living practice, teaching his own children and eventually his grandchildren the grade and gravel and stone that had once seemed to a whole skeptical valley like the foolish ambition of a woman with more grief than sense. The tunnel technology that had nearly died in a flooded trench during its very first summer eventually found its way, decades later, into the careful language of engineers who would give it names Permelia never lived to hear. Passive annual heat storage, thermal labyrinth, ground-to-air heat exchange, formal terms attached to principles she had first proven not through theory, but through the simple, stubborn insistence that a hillside's patient warmth deserved to be trusted as much as any fire a person could build. None of those later names, however precise, ever quite captured what the valley itself remembered best, which was not a diagram or a formula, but the sight of one widow's cabin standing warm and lit against a night that had broken every other hearth for 3 counties around it. What survived longest, though, wasn't the terminology or even the technology itself, but the particular quiet courage of a woman who had knelt in mud beside a ruined trench and chosen against every voice in her valley telling her otherwise to dig it right instead of walking away, who had opened her door in the coldest hour of the century's worst storm to the very man who had once tried to drown her hope in ash and clay, who had understood, long before anyone gave that understanding a name, that the ground beneath a person's feet holds more patience than most people ever think to ask of it, waiting, season after buried season, for someone brave enough to finally dig deep enough to find it. Somewhere along the South River on land Permelia Ashcroft never lived to see settled, her great-granddaughter's own tunnel still holds its steady warmth, dozens over by now, the stone lining repointed by hands that never met the woman who first proved the design yet sound, and yet every child who presses a small palm of that foundation stone on a bitter January morning carries forward, without ever needing to be told, the same simple inheritance a widow once dug out of a hillside with her own 2 hands, refusing to let her father's buried fear become her own.